First, let me introduce what we're doing by saying this. The media are trying to make sense of something that is being referred to as the quiet revival, or others are calling it a slow awakening. Revival would seem to be quite a bold word to use. I'm not sure you can have a quiet revival. I think if revival's happening, we know about it. So people are trying to work out what label to give it, but something seems to be happening. God seems to be stirring something in our nation, and particularly among younger people and young men in particular. And it seems that there's lots of people trying to make sense of it and explain what might be happening, but one of the things that seems to be going on within this is that Gen Z, that's kind of older teens going through into their 20s, were handed a kind of a script for life that says, don't look up to God or out to other kind of authorities and structures. Look in towards yourself. Make your own identity, your own purpose, your own destiny. And it seems that many of those people in that generation are now realizing that secular agenda isn't adding up to much. In fact, all it seems to be doing is making them anxious and empty. And so they're looking now out for other stories, better stories that can make sense of life. Even well-known atheists are beginning to recognize that the cultural Christianity, the cultural Christian heritage of our nation is really, really important. And so we have a responsibility in this moment as a church to offer and proclaim Jesus and his good news. And the reason this is all kind of being talked about in the national media is that church attendance in this country has gone up by 2 million in the last 6 years. That is quite a shift in the narrative from a church that is declining and on its way out. Church attendance in the UK has gone up by 2 million in the last 6 years. Gen Z are half as likely as their parents to be atheists. And we're told from all the research that right now in this country, 1 in 3 people would accept an invitation to church if they received one. People are waking up to the spiritual. And that's why we're doing this series this time. We need to be ready to respond well to what God is doing and to steward well this move of God. There's a prophetic word that was spoken over the UK by a number of kind of well-recognised people back in 2018. This is pre-pandemic. And it was from the passage we're going to look at in 1 Kings 18, where it says, I hear the sound of heavy rain. There's rain coming, and with that rain comes life and life in abundance. And it seems like we're beginning to just see the beginnings of that rain trickling. And so that's the passage we're going to look at this morning. If you want a deep dive into this passage and the subject we're going to look at about prayer, I'd point you towards Tyler Staton's book, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. He's absolutely brilliant. He's got loads of great stuff, and I'm basing a lot of this on part of his book this morning. So let's read 1 Kings 18, 38 to 46. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered them. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." So Ahab went off to eat and drink. But Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees. "Go and look towards the sea," he told his servant. And he went up and looked. "There's nothing there," he said. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." The 7th time, the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." So Elijah said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain came on, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Just got to mention that last line because I'm not going to get to in what we're saying later on. He hitched up his cloak and he ran ahead of a chariot full of horses all the way down to the nearest town. I mean, let's just marvel at that for a moment, shall we? Before we get to what we are going to say this morning, which is this, that in the late 19th century, there was a shoe salesman who came to faith and began preaching the good news to anyone he could gather, telling them about Jesus. D.L. Moody, he became a well-known evangelist, and all through his adult life, he famously carried a list of 100 names in his pocket, 100 friends who had no relationship with Jesus. And his entire evangelism strategy, it seems, was to pray. He pleaded with God to reveal himself to each of them in a way that they could really perceive and take hold of, that they'd really get hold of God's love for them. Moody's labour of love was to pray by name for their salvation. Well, when he died, 96 of the names on that list had become answered prayers. They had come to know Jesus for themselves. Now, I don't know about you, but a 96% success rate in prayer like that, I'd take that any day. But it gets even better. At Moody's funeral, the 4 remaining names were all independently so moved by the service that all of them came to faith at his funeral. It's an amazing testimony and an amazing story, but here's the thing I want to highlight. A shoe salesman became one of the most influential evangelists on record. And how did he do it? Through consistent prayer. You know, when we do Thy Kingdom Come and the prayer room and all of that, one of the things we tend to do is to invite people to pray for 5 people to come to know Jesus. If you've been around with us any length of time, you have probably been invited to do that at some point. I wonder how many of you, how many of us, are still praying for those names. Or perhaps, if you're honest, you're a bit more like me. You do really well and you pray daily for weeks, even months, and then gradually a daily prayer becomes a once-in-a-while prayer. And before you know it, you're not really praying consistently for those 5 names anymore. Now, I don't think that makes me or us a failure if that is you. It probably makes us quite normal, I suspect. We get really inspired by stories like D.L. Moody, but that inspiration wears off just in the course of ordinary life. And yet we can't deny this biblical theme that prayer gives birth to new life. The mysterious, long, and often slow process of spiritual birth is seeded by prayer. And we see this clearly in the life of the prophet Elijah. And so we're going to consider these 3 scenes from his story. The first scene's up on the screen there. They're about the church on fire. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and even licked up the water in the trench. And when the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." So let's just back up a little bit and remind ourselves what this comes off the back of. Israel had forgotten Yahweh, their God. They'd been led into idol worship by their king Ahab, into worship of a false god called Baal. And in this moment, up steps Elijah, who courageously issues this challenge. He says to them, "I'm one of the prophets of Yahweh, and there are 450 prophets of Baal. Let's set up a sacrifice with 2 altars, one to Yahweh, one to Baal. We'll put a bull on the altar," that was standard for worship in those days, "but don't set fire to the sacrifice. Instead, we'll pray and we'll see whose God answers by sending fire from heaven to light the sacrifice. So they do exactly that. The sacrifices are set up, and the 450 prophets of Baal go first. They pray and nothing happens. They shout and nothing happens. They do all kinds of other things to try and get Baal's attention. Nothing happens. Now it's Elijah's turn. And before praying, the first thing he does is he repairs the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. That's really significant. We're going to talk more about altars next week and the next couple of weeks. But he rebuilds the altar as a place of worship to the one true God. Then he gets the people to pour 4 large jars of water onto the offering and the wood. And at face value, that might seem like he's just showing off, because when it's wet, it's obviously going to be harder to set fire to it. But Elijah isn't setting up a magic trick. He's a worshipper preparing to pray. Israel is 3 years into a drought, not a drop of rain in more than 1,000 days. It was devastating them as a people. The country is starving. Needless to say, they were conserving as much water as possible. Limit your bathing. Drink only what you have to. Save everything we can for the crops so that the people might eat. Water is the most limited resource and therefore the most prized possession in this season of drought. Which means that water is the costliest offering Elijah could bring. So when he asks them to pour 4 large jars of water onto the sacrifice, this is a profound act of costly worship and faith. He is offering to God the most lavish sacrifice he could possibly bring. And then finally, Elijah prays, "Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God." And then the fire of the Lord fell, and we heard that it burned up the sacrifice and everything around it, even the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell flat on their faces in worship, crying out, "The Lord, He is God." So before we move on, call to mind that family member or that friend or that person that you work with who you think is furthest away from God. The one that you don't even bother to pray for when we say pray for 5 friends. The one you actively avoid having faith conversations with. Now imagine that person sitting next to you in next week's service. And as we're singing, she falls to the ground, or he falls to the ground, and begins screaming out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Can you imagine witnessing something like that? A visible manifestation of God's presence, followed by people who were hostile to God, falling face down in worship. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds a lot like revival. That sounds like a church on fire. But that's not the end of Elijah's story. It's just the beginning. So let's skip ahead, and we're going to skip ahead all the way to the end, to scene 3, which is the city reborn. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." Keep in mind, again, that Elijah is talking to a desperate political leader. This is the national leader of a starving people. And now Elijah looks him in the eye and tells the king, "Go and celebrate. Light the barbecue, crack open a beer. God is going to give you reason for celebration. The God you just saw light up the altar with fire is now going to provide for the whole city." And that's exactly what happens. 3 years into a drought, a massive downpour drenches the city, and new life springs up in a depressed place. This is the climax of Elijah's story. It's not just about a church on fire. It's about a whole city, a whole people reborn. God doesn't just long for a healthy church or a growing church. God longs to pour out his Spirit on all flesh, on all people, on the whole city. God is jealous for relationship, jealous for each and every person who he has made. God dreams of a city reborn. And that dream might start with a church on fire, but the destination is the renewal of all things, the city reborn. And so for us, it might start potentially with St Matthew's on fire, but the destination is East Park and Eastfield reborn. The journey between those two dreams can be long and winding, which is why we need to jump back to the middle of Elijah's story, to scene 2 and the mountain of prayer. So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. So in the middle of the story, Elijah climbs a mountain, looking out over this desperate city that God loves, and he begins to pray. He bends down to the ground and puts his face between his knees. It's an odd posture for prayer. The Bible regularly mentions people falling face down, just like they were a moment ago with the fire, or people kneeling or raising their hands. Those are all really commonplace. But Elijah bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees. Why are we given this strange detail? I think because it tells us something important. In order to pray for the city, Elijah metaphorically gets into the position of a woman in labour beginning to push. It's a pretty graphic image, right? In the New Testament, the writer James describes Elijah's prayer as fervent. More recently, people have called this type of laborious prayer travailing or contending prayer. But the point is this, that there is a kind of prayer that gives birth to new life. God doesn't only dream of a church on fire, he dreams of a city reborn. And a mountain of prayer is the way from one to the other. But before we go up that mountain of prayer, we need to know this, that prayer for the lost is often slow and unglamorous. So if you look at verse 43, it says this, go look, this is the bit where Elijah's talking with his servant. Go look towards the sea, he tells the servant. And he went and looked, and there's nothing there. 7 times Elijah sends him back. Go and look again. Go and look again. And the 7th time the servant reports there's a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising from the sea. So did you notice Elijah prayed once for fire, and he prays for rain 7 times. The sort of prayer that gives birth to new life is often slow. As someone who has watched 2 babies being born, I can tell you pretty much nothing about the experience of giving birth. I gather it can be a tad uncomfortable though, he says with a cheeky smile. Here's what Jesus says about it. Jesus said this, when her baby is born, the mother forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child has been born into the world. Whatever she went through, this little one who has so far only caused excruciating pain, inconvenience to sleeping patterns, and a promise to be utterly and completely dependent on them for months and years to come, was so worth it. New life requires labour. And spiritually speaking, that is labouring in prayer. But the joy of salvation always far outweighs the preceding pain and struggle and persistence. Plenty of people have been inspired by D.L. Moody's list of 100 people. Far fewer have continued to pray after the inspiration wore off. But if we want that kind of legacy, we've got to live that kind of prayerful life. And birthing prayer is slow. Prayer for the lost is also often unglamorous. I have no doubt that calling down fire from heaven would have won Elijah quite a lot of public admiration. If it was happening today, he'd be speaking at every summer festival and conference going. Praying for rain, on the other hand, was a secret labour, unseen at the top of a mountain and unglamorous. That's the bit we're told to imitate. James 5 reads like this: "The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective." Elijah was a human being just as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Not a mention of fire. We have an appetite for spectacle, whereas God has an appetite for new life. We can't resist the idea of fire from heaven. God can't resist the secret labour of prayer. It's not glamorous, but James says it is powerful and effective. God wants the church on fire because God dreams of the city reborn. So yes, let's rebuild altars, let's offer costly sacrifices, let's seek the fire of God in worship, but let's also allow that fire to ignite us to pray for our city, to pray for this community that God has placed us in of East Park and Eastfield. Elijah's story and James's letter are invitations to labour in prayer, to join with the Holy Spirit in groaning for new life. Every move of God in church history has followed a common pattern. The church catches fire, leading to an increased priority of prayer, resulting in an outpouring of the Spirit on the city. If we want to join in and be ready for a move of God, we need to start in prayer, the kind of prayer that gives birth to new life.